So Pakistan Chowk Community Center welcomes you all to our 6th webinar conversation with you on the topic focusing on organized invasion into quarters. So Pakistan Chowk Community Center is a place where we engage with arts and culture, especially on the pressing queries of engaging with the city and how the city is collaborating towards understanding the built environment. We are also constantly looking for alliances and collaborations, thinking of from academic as well as institutional partnership of our Pakistan Chowk Community Center to think about radical queries of, especially in the thinking of development of cities for future. So I would like to introduce my new project, which is plus 921 Heritage Talks Introduction. का उसका ये तहत है कि it's a project of Pakistan Chowk Community Center, and we are going to be hosting these webinars every 6 months, talking about the built environment, especially focusing on heritage in the aspect in the context of South Asia. So it is very important to understand with our neighboring countries as well, how they are thinking about heritage and how they are thinking about development for future, because real estate is a very important and a pressing point in today's time. How are they incorporating heritage into their daily pragmatics and daily politics? Now, this dialogue on heritage is a global conversation which must take into account the local context. In a rapidly changing world, the dialogue around heritage preservation is shaped by many and relatively new factors. The parameters of what constitutes heritage are expanding and take into account not just the past and tangible heritage sites, but our present as well as our current relationship with spaces we inhabit as communities. Now, Pakistan Chowk Community Center aims to engage a comprehensive dialogue on the above questions by bringing together architects, researchers, urban planners, policymakers, designers, artists, journalists, filmmakers, bloggers, and activists to brainstorm the idea for the protection, dialogue, conservation, rehabilitation, accessibility of heritage sites or public spaces. I would now like to welcome you all to our webinar on the query of high-rise invasion into historic quarters. ये एक बहुत ही अहम query है और बहुत ही अहम question है कि हेरिटेज का आज के ज़माने में रियल स्टेट के साथ क्या रिलेशनशिप है. हम इन दोनों को कैसे समझ सकते हैं कि डेवलपमेंट और हेरिटेज प्रिजर्वेशन दोनों को साथ कैसे लेके चलना है. और इसके लिए मैं अपनी कुलीग अक्सा को कहूँगी कि वो हमारे पैनलिस्ट को इंट्रोड्यूस करें और आज का वेबिनार को एक शुरुआत दे. बहुत शुक्रिया.
Hello everyone and welcome on board. I'll be introducing our panelists for today. We have with us Dr. Masuma Shakir. She's an architect and urbanist. She completed her doctorate from the Bauhaus University in Weimar, Germany in 2018 and has been faculty at the Department of Architecture and Planning at NIDI University since 2007. She has taught architecture design, history, and theory courses in undergraduate along with postgraduate courses in urban planning program. She has been involved in various urban research and design projects at the department itself. Her doctoral research is titled Reconstructing the Sufi Shrine as a Living Cultural Heritage. It looks at the local cultural heritage in the region of Sindh in relation to place. She has presented papers in several conferences and written several articles in newspapers and research journals. We also have with us Arif Belgami Sahab, who is an architect based in Karachi, Pakistan. His office, Arif Belgami Architects, draws on nearly 3 decades of diverse architectural experience gained in the United States and Pakistan in a practice grounded in the regional and cultural context of Pakistan. The firm has a diverse portfolio of works consisting of residential, commercial, educational, and diplomatic buildings. Arif Belgami received a Bachelor of Arts in Design of the Environment in 1987 and a Master of Architecture degree in 1991, both from the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. After completing his studies, Arif worked for a number of years in the United States before returning to Pakistan in 1998. Arif Belgami's work is preoccupied with the craft of making. He is particularly interested in the inherent qualities of materials and how they contribute to the development of the detail as functional and expressive architectural components. He is active in promoting environmental concerns and developments in architecture to address the climate change. He is an advocate for the preservation of the natural environment and the need for green and sustainable development in urban areas. Arif Belgami has been active in architectural education for over 20 years and serves as an adjunct faculty member in the Department of Architecture at the Indus Valley School of Art and Architecture. He has also been involved at many levels in local profession organizations and international forums. We also have with us Director General Manzoor Ahmed Kanasro, who will be representing Department of Tourism, Antiquities and Archives, works under the Sindh government and is tasked with promoting cultural heritage of Sindh, supporting literary activities and conservation of archaeological sites and other heritage sites.
I welcome you all. Thank you so much, Aksa, for sharing their brief background. And it's a pleasure and an absolute, I'm humbled to have DG Saab to come in and be part of this webinar, as well as Arif Belgami and Dr. Masuma. The course of the outline will be in such a way that I would request Dr. Masuma to start first and give a contextual outline. And then DG Saab will respond to by looking at the presentation, and then Arif Saab will lead us into kind of a possibility of a conceptual idea or maybe an implementation idea. And he will conclude by looking at Dr. Masuma's and DG Saab's input and kind of bringing an aspect of how architects think about heritage conservation and kind of protecting from taking development as well as heritage together in the city. So now I would like Dr. Masuma to please share her screen. And we would like to keep, this is just a house rules, that 15 minutes we will take each panelist to talk about, and the last 15 minutes we'll keep it for questions. So thank you so much.
Okay, thank you so much, Aksa, for the introductions, and thank you, Marvi. I think this is a very good initiative by the Pakistan Chowk Community Center, the Heritage Talks, and definitely I think this is a big need for today to create and initiate this dialogue between various stakeholders and having a representative of the government as well today with us. So I'm going to share my screen and share some thoughts from a previous research that I have done. I'm very happy to be able to do this today because I did this research with, some time back and never really took it forward. So I think this is a great opportunity for me to do that. Generally, if we talk about Karachi, and I would immediately get into that, the issue of high-rise invasion in historic areas of Karachi, the contradictions that we have in the growth of Karachi, in what it was, and how the contradictions have come about, is that we must look at the fact that there has been a kind of natural development of Karachi city, the old city areas where the central business district or the financial city of the center of the city has also come about in the same place as the city center and the heritage area of the city. And so वो इलाका जो पहले थोड़ा horizontal ज़्यादा horizontal neighborhood था, as there has been an increase in vertical development in the area. And so when we start to talk about heritage and conservation, heritage is important for our cities. There have been cities that have completely lost their heritage and they've become cities without histories. Past और present के बीच में future के साथ जो connection है हमारा, वो culturally represent करता है एक society को, एक nation को, एक शहर को, और उसकी जो uniqueness होती है, that is represented from that. Cities generally all over the world, with their trends in high-rise and modern developments, they have started to look all the same. And having heritage adds that identity factor to cities. They become themselves, they represent their histories. The people who have made and contributed to the cities, they are also important and they're also represented in these cities. So they bring in the intangible attributes to cities. And of course, there has been an evolution of the city in terms of how the city has developed and grown, and not only physically but also culturally. तो ये चीजें शहर की मेकिंग के अंदर, उसकी मॉर्फोलॉजी के अंदर, उसके फिजिकल फैब्रिक के अंदर होती हैं, और इनको प्रिजर्व करने की जरूरत होती है. क्यों होती है? Why is it important to preserve history? And I mean, these are very basic questions. But sometimes they're important to talk about preservation of historic areas of Karachi, important because Karachi, and what is, I think the question of what is Karachi and what does it represent for us, what does it represent for the various communities who live here, and I think this is important because Karachi does not belong to any one community. It's multi-ethnic, it's multicultural, and that is the face of Karachi. That is what the different areas and parts of Karachi show and represent. And this is what the community aspect of different areas, I think, needs to be kept intact in some way or the other. The question for today that I'd like to highlight for me would be, how can we actually look at heritage conservation and modern development in some kind of a workable relationship? एक misguided सा belief है हमारे शहर में, in practice it seems like या तो heritage conserve हो सकता है या development हो सकती है. तो this is, in my opinion, a misguided belief. ऐसा नहीं है कि एक हो सकता है और दूसरा नहीं हो सकता. बहुत दुनिया में दूसरे भी शहर हैं जहाँ पे एक workable relationship establish हुई है और ये हो सकती है. It can be good for the economic development of the city as well, and for its environment. It definitely has a potential in terms of local tourism as well as international tourism. And of course, retaining the history of the place is generally important for our future generations. So when we start to look at conservation as a planning issue, it's important to also highlight that conservation planning is not something that only architects and planners can do. It's multidisciplinary. And economics are definitely a very important part of it. The real estate values, construction costs, ये सारी economic realities हैं that have to be tied in together with conservation planning, along with its, the physical planning of city, as well as socio-cultural networking. So, एक general सा मैंने I'll just give a quick kind of this thing. Conservation planning needs to be looked at as a multidisciplinary, factor. It requires a kind of approach where professionals from multiple disciplines actually pool in and work together to create a working situation where there can be development and there can be conservation at the same time. So we are able to support the needs of the present as well as retain our history as well. I have some examples that I'd like to share. That are actually examples of how conservation has taken place in some of the other cities. So I have examples from Seoul and also from Singapore. So this is from Seoul. It's the Hanok Regeneration Project. It's a conservation of the living heritage. Some pictures of that. This Hanok Regeneration Project is basically where they have conserved the community. So it's living heritage, the community is present, and the government. So always there has to be in conservation a working relationship between the government and the community that is living in a place if they are to maintain the same community and they have managed to live there for some period of time. So physical environment को भी upgrade करने की ज़रूरत होती है. Given certain laws and that need to be reinforced, the Hanok Regeneration Project has received UNESCO Asia Pacific Heritage Awards for their conservation. And the government has provided some infrastructure and some regulations on the pattern of which this conservation has taken place. It's quoted to be a successful example in different researches. The second example that I want to bring forth is that of Singapore. The multi-pronged approach to conservation has been taken over in Singapore, where there have been a range of applicable solutions that have been, brought forth and taken over to address a diverse set of situations within the city, जिसमें पुराने structures को conserve किया गया है और जो आज की requirements हैं उसके साथ उन structures को उनके heritage को they have sort of put these together. So they have identified historic districts. Historic districts they have given the most amount of value or significance to the historic districts, where they say they have the strictest guidelines that they follow, and the owners have to conserve the entire historic buildings. Historic buildings को conserve करने के लिए कुछ incentives वगैरह भी मिलते हैं और infrastructure upgradation होता है, so that the people who are using the places, they are able to also live in the same time, have modern infrastructure as well. Of course, traffic वगैरह के issues होते हैं that have to be resolved so that the urban environment also works well. So apart from the historic districts, the other three types of conservation categories that they have allowed adaptive reuses and extensions to conserved buildings in some following some bylaws, so that there is some part of the various buildings that are conserved, and then they are allowed some extensions with some height controls and density controls through which there is a relationship between conserved area and there is extensions that have been allowed to keep up with the requirements for the housing areas. So secondary settlements and the rare portions of the conserved buildings are allowed to be extended, and you have a maximum height that is allowed. The bungalow areas where the main house has been kept and then the outhouse have been demolished, and new extensions have been allowed up to a certain height to maintain the main house as the primary. Then there are residential historic districts within, again, where the new rare extensions of these areas are lower than the main roof. So these are multi-story as well. And this kind of a relationship allows for some flexibility in adapting the buildings for modern living as well. So this kind of flexibility is important in conservation guidelines that need to be considered, and they need to be, discussed and debated and developed, so that building owners can also, balance the opportunity cost that they incur in heritage conservation. So these are some images of the conservation that we see in Singapore that have been done. You have some very clearly conserved areas, like the first picture on the right. You have, the modern development is separate from the conserved area. And then you can see some heritage buildings and new buildings that have been extensions that have been allowed to, so that, the heritage is retained and it maintains a certain language, and the new development that happens also has a certain language. So there may be a contrast or it's respected in some way. So these are some examples that I'm just going to quickly go through. So we have, a set of different ideas for discussion today. The third example I have, of course, then is the other end of the spectrum where we have gentrification. This is a case from Xintiandi neighborhood in Shanghai, which is gentrification in the sense that people who lived here, they have moved out. The place is completely, taken over by an elitist development. The buildings have been retained, but the functions within them include a set of coffee shops and restaurants and various such commercial functions that make it a tourist attraction. So this is the before and after picture of Xintiandi. So this is the other end of the spectrum where, in kind of summary, if we say that we have a spectrum for creating relationships of heritage conservation with new development, this is an entire range that these examples actually bring forth, where we have traditional conservation on one end of this spectrum where, things are properly conserved. and new building high density development where the city completely loses its history on the other end. And then you have multi-pronged conservation approach, as we see in Singapore. There are other examples as well, and gentrification, which is more, bending to the other side. But the question is really, how can we create a balance between new development and conservation? And that is the challenge. And we need to have these discussions to talk about, how can we have both of these? So looking at Karachi and trying to see what are the dilemmas of Karachi's heritage areas, we have morphology of the city that has changed over time. जो open or built का ratio है, यानी जो हमारे पुराने वक्त में जब ये इलाके बने थे, उस वक्त cost of land was less and the cost of construction was higher. So we see that the properties that we have are bigger in size, but the footprints of older areas of the buildings are smaller. This has changed, of course. Now the cost of land is much higher. Cost of construction comparatively is also high, but it's comparatively less. So what this does is that now there is, a trend to maximize building density, to minimize open spaces on plots. How can this be resolved? What kind of recommendations can there be? I mean, once we put out the problem in front of us, we can see how we can address this. But perhaps there could be an idea where entire blocks are conserved. And so if we have open areas could be amalgamated together. And there could be, heritage conservation and modern development that is proposed so that, there is some balance approach to larger areas. Then over time, there has also been a change in the living patterns in the sense कि जो पुरानी buildings थी, उनका street के साथ एक बहुत important connection था. The streets were actually their public spaces. This is where their windows, their verandas, their corridors opened up. This has changed because उस वक्त traffic का मसला नहीं था. अब traffic, noise, environmental pollution have prominently, become an issue. So if we have to conserve buildings and recreate that relationship, our street spaces need to be relooked at. And we need to remove these polluting elements in order to reestablish this connection between buildings and streets, so that this becomes a working relationship and for heritage areas. Building heights are, of course, an issue. Purani buildings ke upar jo naye structures additions ho rahe hain, wo, there need to be enforcement of regulations around which these are done, and there has to be a better approach, more respected approach to conservation. Okay, so to wrap up, economic parameters, I've already spoken about how there has been change in land prices and conservation. This is just kind of summing up what I have already said, really, that the activities that are reinforced in heritage areas also have to be compatible to the built heritage. I mean, we cannot push out people. I think it is a business hub. Our old city areas are active for them markets, and they have to be a working relationship for them. What doesn't work for the heritage need to be perhaps moved out to some other areas maybe. But as it is a business center, and that is something that we need to respect and need to accommodate within heritage areas. But at the same time, we need to identify what our heritage areas are signifying. What are they important for, and how can we conserve them? Perhaps social preservation or whatever history that they are representative of can be brought forth more clearly through museums or through training centers where communities can be tied up with better. And apart from that, in terms of social parameters, of course, जो हमारे social context है, पगड़ी system का एक issue है old city areas के अंदर, इसको resolve करना एक major, this is a major issue that needs to be looked at. In terms of how the developers and how these buildings are being, or the old buildings are facing this issue, we see in terms of restoration, those buildings that are also restored, we see that there is an issue of lack of knowledge of how to do conservation or the technical skill of conservation itself. This knowledge gap needs to be filled up by conservationists, by creating a set of easy to read graphics, perhaps, or making technical skill easily, it needs to be put across in ways. And so the different stakeholders, which includes the corporate sector as well, किस किस्म की modern day development हो सकती है इनके साथ, and how multinational corporations or various other developers can recognize that heritage can be restored so that it can also be of economic benefit for the commercial areas. The government has a very important role to play in this entire process in general. Yeah, I will, because we're short on time, so I will just skip over this. This is a repetition of that. So that would be the end of the presentation.
Thank you so much,
Yes.
Dr. Masuma. Really appreciate it. We will loop you into expanding more on the factors that you said and practically how we can think about it in our last segment. DG Saab, I would like you to respond to some of the settings that Dr. Masuma has placed. Aapke khayal se, from a government's perspective and angle, आपको क्या लगता है कि क्या-क्या issues हैं? और पहले तो आप of course introduce कराएं कि ये department क्या करता है, advisory board का क्या है, आप एक पूरा overarching view बताएं और उसके बाद आप हमें अंदर लेके चलें, क्योंकि कुछ students भी हैं इस webinar में जो कि आपसे समझ पाएंगे और सीख सकेंगे कि आखिरकार हेरिटेज सिंध का एक ऐसे लेवल पर क्यों है और उसकी प्रॉब्लम्स फिर आप एक्सप्लेन करें।
अच्छा, मैं डिपार्टमेंट की तरफ से जो आपका डिटेल में आपको दे दूंगा कि डिपार्टमेंट का रोल क्या है हेरिटेज के हवाले से। तो बेसिकली गवर्नमेंट ने एक इदारा तो बनाया हुआ है एंटीक्विटीज, लेकिन इसमें हमें एक दो कमेटी जो इदारे को एडवाइस करती हैं और इदारा उसको फॉलो करता है। एक टेक्निकल कमेटी बनी हुई है हमारे पास, जिसमें शारी है, आरिफ हसन साहब हैं, डॉक्टर अनिला है एनएडी से, डॉक्टर सोहेल कलोड़ो साहब हैं, नदीम साहब हैं बिल्डिंग कंट्रोल अथॉरिटी से। तो हमारे पास रीजन ये है कि जैसे भी इदारा कोई तरफ से कुछ भी नहीं करता जब तक कमेटी के रूल्स ऐसे बने हुए हैं, इदारा बाउंस दे फिर आप उस पर एक्शन ले। तो रिसेंटली हमने जो सर्वे किया हुआ है कराची में, तो 1700 के लगभग जो हैं, अराउंड 1700 ये बिल्डिंगें कराची में सिर्फ जो है वो हेरिटेज डिक्लेयर की हुई हैं, और अभी कुछ मेरे ख्याल में कोई 60 के करीब और अभी रिकमेंड होने जा रही हैं एज अ हेरिटेज। लेकिन प्रॉब्लम ये है कि यहाँ पे मैं तो जो 6 साल में मुझे यहाँ पे हो गए हैं इदारे में सर्व किए हुए, मेन रीजन यहाँ पे रियल एस्टेट हाई राइज बिल्डिंग का जो है ये इतना इसने जकड़ा हुआ है इदारे को, अपना हेरिटेज बिल्डिंग्स को, कि हर ओनर चाह रहा है कि हमें परमिशन दी जाए कि हम हाई राइज बिल्डिंग बनाएं। हर रेजिडेंशियल एरिया में 1-2 बंगले बने हुए, तीसरा घर जो कह रहा है कि हमें इजाजत दें कि हम हाई राइज बिल्डिंग बनाएं। और ये मेरे पास अब भी कोई बड़ी तादाद ऐसी एप्लीकेशंस पड़ी हुई हैं कि वो चाह रहे हैं कि हमें इजाजत दें कि हम इसको हाई राइज बना दें। और लेकिन सख्ती हमने इतनी की हुई है कि इवन आपको रिसेंटली मालूम होगा कि हमारे स्टेट गेस्ट हाउस को अपना प्राइम मिनिस्टर जब थी पीटीआई गवर्नमेंट, तो उन्होंने इसको 7 स्टार होटल बनाने की तैयारी थी, हाई राइज बिल्डिंग उस पर उन्होंने प्रपोज किया था। तो बड़ा हमने रिजर्व किया, बड़े प्रेशर थे, ज़ाहिर है प्राइम मिनिस्टर उसमें दिलचस्पी ले रहा था, लेकिन हमने रिफ्यूज कर दिया कि नहीं, हमने नहीं करेंगे। जो डिपार्टमेंट कर सकता है वो करता है। लेकिन एक्चुअली ये है कि जब तक ये हम सारे जो सीनियर रहें या और बहुत सारे एनजीओज हैं, अब जब तक हम कराची में हाई राइज के लिए कोई एक जगह मुख्तस करें, एक एरिया मुख्तस करें, और दूसरी जगहों पे हाई राइज जब नहीं होगी तब हमारी हेरिटेज बचेगी। रीज़न यही है कि कई ऐसी बिल्डिंग्स हैं जिनको हमने कंजर्वेशन के लिए हमने प्रपोजल्स बनाए, उसकी हमने एस्टिमेशन करवाई, गवर्नमेंट से फंड्स लिए, इवन मैंने उनके टेंडर्स किए, जब हम अच्छा हमारे पास रूल्स में ये है कि इसके साथ हमें एग्रीमेंट करनी पड़ती है कि भाई हम ये इस पे कंजर्वेशन करने जा रहे हैं। तो वो जब हम एग्रीमेंट करने पहुंचे तो उन्होंने सबने रिफ्यूज कर दिया। उसमें नाम मुझे याद नहीं है, वहां पे है मोटर पोल के सामने थी, सदर में 2-4 बिल्डिंग्स थी। जब हम पहुंचे तो उन्होंने इनकार कर दिया। रीजन क्या था? रीजन ये है कि ये बिल्डिंगें गिरें तो हम वहां पे डिपार्टमेंट ने गवर्नमेंट हमने कोशिश की कि गवर्नमेंट से हम फंड्स लें और जो ये हेरिटेज बिल्डिंग्स हैं इनकी हम कंजर्वेशन करें। तो बहुत बिल्डिंग्स थी जिनकी हमने सर्वे किया, उनकी हमने एस्टिमेशन करवाई, बजट हमें रिसीव हुआ। और जब हम टेंडर करने गए तो हमें जो एक्ट में ये हुआ है कि हमें जहां पे भी कंजर्वेशन करने जाएंगे, अगर प्राइवेट कोई बिल्डिंग है तो हम उस ओनर के साथ एग्रीमेंट करेंगे। तो जब हम एग्रीमेंट करने पहुंचे तो उन्होंने रिफ्यूज कर दिया। रीजन क्या था? कि उनको ये आसरा है कि ये हमारी बिल्डिंग गिरेगी और इस पे हाई राइज बिल्डिंग बनेगी। तो मेन रीजन यही है कि हर वो ओनर, कोई बंगला है या कोई ऐसी फ्लैट बने हुए हैं, सबकी यही कोशिश है कि बिल्डिंग गिरे और हम इसको, हालांकि बहुत सारी कोशिश हमने की है कि भाई आप नहीं बना सकते, आप हमें अप्रोच करें, हम आपको बना के दे, गवर्नमेंट आपको बना के दे रही है। लेकिन रीजन यही है कि हर जगह पे हाई राइज अलो है, जहां पे भी आप जाएं हाई राइज बना दें। तो ये सारे इसी इंतजार में बैठे हुए हैं कि हमें ये बिल्डिंग गिरे। अभी तक हमने जो कई लोगों ने कुछ तो ऐसे बिल्डर हैं वो परचेज कर लेते हैं पीछे डेट में, फिर आहिस्ता आहिस्ता उनको पीछे से गिराते रहते हैं। तो हमने बहुत सारी बिल्डिंग्स पे FIR कटाई हुई हैं ओनर्स पे, हमने चौकाज इशू किए हुए हैं, हमने सीज की हुई हैं कई बिल्डिंग्स। लेकिन उससे हल यही नहीं होगा। ये होगा कि मैंने गवर्नमेंट को कई मतलब जब भी हमारी मीटिंग्स हुई है तो मैंने उनको यही रिक्वेस्ट किया कि सर कोई एक एरिया आप मुख्तस करें जहां भी हाई राइज बिल्डिंग आप उनको अलो करें कि वहां पे हाई राइज बिल्डिंग बने। हर जगह पे हर दूसरी बिल्डिंग तीसरा ओनर चाह रहा है कि मैं हाई राइज बना दूं। तो एक रीजन है ये। जब तक अच्छा, इसके अलावा जो हमारी जो बिल्डिंग्स थी उन पे ओनर्स ने नो डाउट कोशिश की कि इनको हम डैमेजेस करें। तो हमारा एक्ट था, उसमें कुछ गुंजाइश थी तो उसको हम सख्त करें। तो वो आपको भी नॉलेज है कि हमने वो उसको भी करके असेंबली भेजा हुआ है। इंशाल्लाह कुछ अरसे में, थोड़े अरसे में वो एक्ट पास हो जाएगा। तो उसमें यह है कि सख्त सजाएं दी हुई हैं। लेकिन रीजन जो मैंने जो पाया है वो यही है, रियल एस्टेट। हर बिल्डर यही चाह रहा है कि हमें ये जगह मिले और हम उसको हाई राइज बना दें। तो ये एक रीजन है कि इसको हम अगर कंट्रोल कर पाए कि एक मखसूस एरिया उनको आप हाई राइज के लिए बना दें, बाकी जो जहाँ पे है रेजिडेंशियल एरिया वहां पे कोई भी हाई राइज बिल्डिंग ना बने, तो ये सारी हेरिटेज हमारी बच सकती है। और गवर्नमेंट चाह रही है कि जो है ये अब हैदराबाद में भी है, यही अपना लाड़काना और दूसरी जगहों पे भी है, शिकारपुर में। तो ये कमर्शियल वाला जो रियल एस्टेट वाला जो सिस्टम है ये डैमेज कर रहा है हमारी हेरिटेज।
मैं एक आपसे ये सवाल पूछना चाह रही हूँ कि ये जो आप हदूद की बात करते हैं कि एरिया को डिफाइन करा जाए कि ये एक हमारा ओल्ड टाउन है या हिस्टोरिक एरिया है, इस पे कभी कोई एक्सरसाइज या कभी कोई काम हुआ है?
सच जैसे होना चाहिए अकॉर्डिंग वो नहीं। इवन मैंने अपनी आ रही है आवाज में?
जी 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 बताएं।
तो ये मैं एडवाइस करता रहता हूँ एक्चुअली, जब तक ये अपना सिविल सोसाइटी इस चीज को आगे नहीं बढ़ाएगी तो गवर्नमेंट तब तक मुतवज्जो नहीं होगी। सिविल सोसाइटी पे ये किरदार होगा।
मंजूर साहब, जैसे कि हमारी PCAT-P है, IAP ऑर्गेनाइजेशंस हैं, आर्किटेक्ट्स की ये प्लेटफॉर्म्स हैं, इनके साथ अगर कभी कोलैबोरेशन की जाए गवर्नमेंट की और ये एक्सरसाइज अगर प्ले किया जाए तो मुझे लगता है कि इसमें बहुत आप लोगों को भी फायदा होगा कि अगर हम एक तरह से एक दायरा बना लें कि ये ओल्ड टाउन का पैरामीटर है। तो कभी नेक्स्ट टाइम अगर आप मिनिस्टर साहब से बात करें या क्या करें, और PCAT-P जो पाकिस्तान काउंसिल आर्ट्स टाउन प्लानर्स का है वो आके इसको पिच करे और आइडिया प्ले करे, तो हम आपके लिए बिल्कुल फॉरवर्ड प्ले कर सकते हैं इस चीज को कि हम एज आर्किटेक्ट्स आपको रेकमेंड कर सकते हैं कि किस तरह हम एक ओल्ड टाउन का एक पैरामीटर्स को डेवलप करें। अभी आरिफ साहब भी इसके बारे में मजीद आपके साथ बात करेंगे, उनकी प्रेजेंटेशन आप जरूर थोड़ा फॉलो करिएगा, ये एक तरह से एक रिकमेंडेशन है आपके लिए। पर जो दूसरी चीज आपने बात की थी कि जो SPCA है वो आप लोगों के साथ कितना क्लोजली काम करता है टू अंडरस्टैंड कि अगर इस तरह के अगर हाई राइजेस का स्केल अगर बहुत आना शुरू हो गया तो फिर तो बहुत मुश्किल है इसको प्रिजर्व करना, फिर तो आउट ऑफ हैंड हो जाएगी ये बात। अभी तो हम उस लेवल पे नहीं है, अभी तो फिर भी ग्राउंड +3 स्केल चल रहा है ओल्ड टाउन का, स्पेशली पाकिस्तान चौक के एरिया वाला जो एरिया है। उसमें अभी भी इतनी इन्वेजन नहीं हुई है, मगर शायद खदशा है कि हो जाएगा। तो इसके बारे में आप थोड़ा बताएंगे?
जी बिल्कुल, गवर्नमेंट अगर आपकी तरफ से रिकमेंडेशन आ जाए तो मैं बिल्कुल उस चीज को आगे बढ़ाऊंगा, और ये चीज ही इसका हल है। हम कितनी भी कोशिश करें तो हम नहीं इसको बचा पाएंगे जब तक ये चीज हम ना करें। तो काइंडली अगर आपकी तरफ से रिकमेंडेशन आ जाए, उस चीज को मैं मिनिस्टर साहब से डिस्कस करके इसको आगे बढ़ा दूं, तो ये पॉसिबल है, हो सकती है ये चीज। मैं ये कह रहा था कि अगर आप लोगों की तरफ से अगर कोई रिकमेंडेशन आ जाए, जो ये अपने डिस्कस किया हमने, तो इस एडवाइस को हम आगे बढ़ा सकते हैं। और हम चाह रहे हैं कि आप लोगों के साथ मिलकर एक चीज बनाएं, इसकी है कि हम हेरिटेज को बचाएं। तो यही एक रीजन होगा कि हम
मंजूर साहब, आई वुड लाइक यू टू कंटिन्यू दिस कॉन्वर्सेशन। अभी प्रेजेंटेशन देख लेते हैं एंड वी विल। जी जी, आप जरा रुकिएगा, हम इनकी प्रेजेंटेशन देख लेते हैं। जी
यस यस।
नहीं, एक्चुअली आई एम वेरी इनकरेज। मंजूर साहब, जो आपने बातें कही हैं वो जो मैं प्रेजेंट करने जा रहा हूँ वो उसको रिइंफोर्स करती हैं एक तरह से। दे आर तो आई थिंक आई एम हैप्पी टू सी दैट द डिपार्टमेंट इज आल्सो थिंकिंग इन सम सिमिलर डायरेक्शन। सो एक मसला है ऑब्वियसली जो मैं पॉइंट आउट करना चाह रहा हूँ कि वो ये है कि वी हैव अ हिस्टोरिक center of our city, jo started somewhere over here. This is the old part of the city. Jo ab, the city has grown. Today the city is like this, or that historic center is right around where the word Karachi is, right in the middle here. तो वो शहर इतना फैल गया है, मगर सारा प्रेशर इसी सेंट्रल बिजनेस डिस्ट्रिक्ट पे है, which is all our heritage. और हम basically we try to preserve it to the Sindh Heritage Act. अब उसमें मसला ये है कि the Sindh Heritage Act tries to preserve all these the main monuments and stuff, but then there are also these buildings जो एक तरह का एक scale है हमारे शहर का, which is this ground+3 walk up scale. और इसी हिसाब से हमारी सारी सड़कें भी बनी हुई हैं streets के scale, with the streets, open air, access to daylight. All of these things depend on this scale. अब मुसीबत ये है कि एक तरफ we've got the Heritage Act trying to preserve these buildings, then on the other hand you have the Sindh Building Control bylaws, which basically have given a blanket FAR that results in a building that's about 3 or 4 times the size of these buildings in height. तो अब हर बंदे की ख्वाहिश यही होती है कि मैं बिल्डिंग इसको गिरा के मैं हाई राइज बना लूं और मेरे कुछ पैसे बन जाएं। अब हम तो यही होता है कि these buildings start losing them, एक एक करके गायब होनी शुरू होती हैं। This is basically the fabric of our historic center, southern area. और अगर जैसे this is the scale of the streets. So अगर आप इसमें high rises बनाएंगे तो can you imagine what the traffic jam is going to be like? So इसमें the main thing to keep in mind is this, is कि ultimately जिस चीज को हम हेरिटेज समझते हैं वो किसी की मिल्कियत है और किसी का एक एसेट है, तो वो तो ये चाहेगा कि मैं अगर फर्ज करें किसी के लेट्स से एंसेस्टर्स ने, वालिदैन ने उनको विरसे में जमीन दी है या बिल्डिंग दी है, वो तो चाहेंगे कि उसको मैक्सिमाइज करें, उसका प्रोस्पेक्ट जितना भी उसका इकोनॉमिक गेन है। तो दोज आर द थिंग्स दैट वी आर फाइटिंग अगेंस्ट, कि वो हर एक बंदा चाह रहा है कि मेरी जो मिल्कियत है उस पर मैं उसको maximize the economic potential of that property. So we can't fight that in a way. I mean, somehow we have to create this win-win situation कि heritage भी बच जाए और जो लोग जिनका ये एक asset है वो भी उसका फायदा मिल सके. And this is the tussle that's going on in the city at the moment. I think कि एक तरफ लोग हैं जो कहते हैं कि भाई ये हमारा asset है और इसको किसी तरह जो है हेरिटेज के रोस्टर से, हेरिटेज लिस्ट पर से निकाल दिया जाए ताकि हम इसको गिरा दें और इसकी जगह हाई राइज बन जाए. And this is what ends up happening. On the right hand side you see this lovely heritage buildings, and on the left hand side of Zebunusa Street you can already see that we've lost it. And what's coming up instead doesn't have the character, doesn't have the quality, doesn't have the, और अब तो इससे कई गुना ज़्यादा ऊंची बिल्डिंगें बन रही हैं. और और जब कुछ समझ नहीं आता है कि क्या करें इसके साथ, तो we end up with these kind of nonsensical situations where we we take a building, a fine building like the City Bank building, which was originally the Lloyds Bank building, a beautiful building, and a building that was intact and usable, and then along comes a proposal to put a high-rise in its place, और उसके ऊपर चढ़ा के you end up with a proposal that looks like this. So, the building is reduced to, probably the size of a toe, and it overpowers, right on top of Meriwether Tower, which falls under the Antiquities Act. Is building ka beda gark ho gaya hai. This building is gutted. This building is nothing but skin now, and it's only a court order, a stay order from the court that has prevented this high rise from being built, and it's being built on a tiny street jahan uski koi aane aamudraft ki bhi gunjaish nahi hai. It's so these are the sort of proposals that come out when you don't have any other solution to deal with the the economic potential of land that has been listed as heritage. So ab isko kis tarah se bachaya jaye? Well, there are solutions to these things, and one of the things that I want to talk a little bit about the way the Heritage Act is created. The Heritage Act seems to be this ek tarah se ek zabardasti hai. The Heritage Act seems to suggest that we're going to impose on the owner of the heritage, and we'll force them to preserve their building. और उसमें फिर the other clauses in the act seem to suggest as if the person who owns the heritage is going to enter into some voluntary partnership. He wants to make money on his property. और अगर heritage ना होता तो वो उसका हक होता. And so they are thinking कि ये तो हमारा हक मारा जा रहा है. And that's the tussle that is being played out. And somehow, rather than fighting it, there has to be a solution that recognizes that person's right to develop his property and our right as a community to preserve our heritage. And there has to be a way that ये दोनों चीजें side by side हो सकें, जो इस वक्त हो नहीं पा रही हैं, और इस वक्त ये sort of ये tension चल रहा है आपस में. Now, what I want to talk about is when we look at property rights, right? And it's a time-honored, ancient law that if I own a piece of property, I get to do whatever I want. And मैं अगर मुझे आसमान तक building बनानी, मैं आसमान तक building बना सकता हूँ, मुझे मैं कर सकता हूँ. That's basically your inherent right as somebody who owns property. So अब हम as a community, as a government, what we try to do is we try to put limits on it. We try to say कि आप इतना बना सकते हैं, इतना नहीं बना सकते हैं. And then when we get into a situation where we're talking about heritage, then we're saying कि you are the owner of a special piece of property that we want you to not build on. So अब वो जो जिसके development rights हैं, the owner of that property is not able to exercise those development rights. So what I'd like to propose is what's called transferable development rights. And ये कोई नई concept नहीं है, and I'll show. Now, transferable development rights, what transferable development rights do is they, in a nutshell, they separate the right to develop from the ownership of the property. Meaning, if I own a piece of land and I want to develop on it, ek wo mera hak hai. Okay, what transferable development rights does is it takes that hak, that right to develop, and it makes it a saleable, marketable commodity. So I can say, if I can sell that right to somebody for equal to the amount that I would make if I were to develop this site, I'm willing to give that up and preserve this. So, the definition, as is pointed out here, Transferable development rights is a market-based technique that encourages voluntary transfer of growth from places where community would like to see less development. These are called sending areas, to places where community would like to see more development, called receiving areas. The sending areas can be environmentally sensitive properties, open spaces, agricultural land, wildlife habitat, historic landmarks, or any other place that are important to a community. The receiving areas should be places that the general public has agreed are appropriate for extra development because they are close to jobs, shopping, schools, transportation, and other urban services. So in a nutshell, what you're doing is you're saying the right to develop, we'll take the right to develop this and allow you to sell it to somebody who can apply that to another piece of property where government has given the permission to develop additionally to, like for example, and this has been tried in many areas. In the US, this has been going on since the mid-60s. There are tons of examples of how you can take, you can transfer the development rights from a piece of property or an area and apply it to another piece of property. In a nutshell, this is what it means. If I have, for example, if I'm allowed to build, let's say a certain FAR, let's say we are talking about 1:5, and you have a historic building that is occupying a 1:1 FAR, and the guy says, owner says, bhai, main to iske 4-5 guna badi building bana sakta hu. If we allow him to take the leftover square footage from that FAR and sell it to somebody else, then he gets the value of his property. He gets to maximize the development potential of his property without actually building it. And somebody else might take that and apply it to an area that is zoned for very aggressive high-rise development and has been provided with the amenities and infrastructure to support that kind of development. Okay, so, and that's one way, that way you get to preserve your heritage areas. Now, in this example on the left here, this is being applied to single buildings side by side. कि भाई इधर से आपने इसको heritage building को preserve करने की खातिर आपने यहाँ का जो undeveloped potential था वो आपने किसी और को बाजू में बेच दिया. This can also apply to whole regions, and I think that when we're looking at an area like our old city, which has not just buildings that need to be preserved, but the character and scale of that whole region that needs to be preserved, because the street infrastructure can't support intensive high-rise development. You would take this whole area and you take all of Sadar and you say, okay, we'll preserve all of Sadar at this scale of ground plus 3, and we will allow the development, the developable potential as per the bylaws of SBCA, and transfer that to some other area. And the city in its master plan has to define where those areas might be. Okay. I'm not going to go into all of this. Isme kafi technicalities hain. But I can share this. It's in a nutshell, what it's doing is it's saying that the city identifies areas that it wants to see as high density development, where sky's the limit, where you can build as much as you want, and the city will provide the roads, the utilities, the basic infrastructure to support that kind of thing. And you receive from your historic districts the FAR, the unrealized FAR of those properties to be applied to these in high density areas. तो उसका नतीजा ये होगा कि अगर फर्ज करें आपने पूरे शहर को 1:5 का FAR ratio दिया हुआ है, तो then some areas might actually be able to develop beyond that 1:5 का FAR, and at the expense or to the benefit of the heritage areas where you will retain the lower FAR. फायदा क्या होगा? The guy who owns the heritage property or who lives in the heritage district that you might create gets the financial benefit as if he had developed his property without having done it. Now, अच्छा, उसमें एडवांटेज एक ये होता है कि this kind of limitation gets written into the deed of the property. तो ऐसा नहीं है कि कोई बाद में आके कोई कोशिश करे कि चुपचाप फिर से बना दे, कोई हाई राइज बना दे गिरा के बिल्डिंग को. You write it into the deed of that property that this building has transferred its development rights and it's now only zoned for some much less. So in a nutshell, that's the proposal. So the primary benefit, it permits preservation of land where further development is undesirable for a variety of reasons. It does so without loss of new development to the community, because in the end, आप उतना ही बना रहे हैं जितना पहले बना रहे थे. ठीक है ना? अगर आप पूरे शहर में आप on average 1:5 के हिसाब से हाई राइजेस बना रहे थे, तो अब आप यही कर रहे हैं कि उतना ही बनेगा, कुछ जगहों पे कम होगा, कुछ जगहों पे ज्यादा होगा. So ऐसा नहीं है कि you are missing out on the developable potential of the city. ठीक है? And there are a lot of things, details that can be factored into this. You can put in a condition that a person who benefits from this policy of transferring their development rights assumes the responsibility of restoring his property and to preserving his property if it's a heritage property. And there's a lot of things you can do with it. So anyway, as I was saying, it does so without loss of any new development of the community. It does so without depriving landowners of reasonable economic return on their property. The great advantage of the TDR approach is that it involves minimal expense to the municipality. The technique does have certain drawbacks, however. It demands a greater degree of administrative attention than most zoning, because you have to keep a track of what properties have sold their rights, what properties haven't, etc. But that's not difficult to do in this day and age of, with the amount of IT information that's, technology that's out there. TDRs must be carefully administered so that the exact status of development rights on all parcels in sending and receiving areas is known at all times. But development rights bank is used. I didn't talk about a development rights bank, but a development rights bank, basically what it does is it balances out the supply and demand of development rights. For example, if somebody is keen to sell their development rights, but there is no buyer willing to receive that, then a bank that may be run by the municipality or a commercial bank buys up that right in order to sell it. Okay, so there's a way to trade these development rights. I won't get into that at the moment. So I'm just saying that the very nature of a TDR as a system for the transfer of rights to develop land in exchange for compensation requires continuing commitment by municipality. They have to basically maintain the status of these places as they are created. ये नहीं हो सकता कि बाद में आके आप कहें कि now we're going to the hell with the heritage district and we're going to develop this as well. Now, the funny thing is that this is not an unknown concept. This used to be in the SBCA bylaws. Now, if you look at the SBCA bylaws from 2007, right here, there's a section on transferable development rights. It's in a very sort of kacha status, not quite figured out. There's a lot of, sort of unclear, 3-4 clauses. But then what happened in 2013, ye gaib ho gaye. And abhi bhi, in the current SBCA bylaws, this thing's still there. There's still a heading says transferable development rights. The clause headings are still there and they are blank. So it seems like, the commitment, the political will to do this sort of thing is not there, even though the potential is there to do this. So I think that this is the place that we need to go with this. Okay, or isme, what do we do? I mean, for example, ye jo blue mein outline hua hua area hai, meri nazar mein, this is the area that one may want to preserve. Where do we put it? Maybe we put it here. Maybe we take out certain areas like this. I'm just, मैंने बगैर कुछ सोचे समझे मैंने एक एरिया आइडेंटिफाई किया है, मगर मेरी नजर में शहर फैल रहा है, बहुत फैल रहा है. अब आप एक सेंट्रल बिजनेस डिस्ट्रिक्ट पर डिपेंड नहीं कर सकते, because people are coming from miles and miles away. So what will need to happen as the city grows is that, we need to think of that city as a big area. अब इस big area में, we have a M10 corridor, right? Now you could create high density CBDs in these areas that are commercial, districts, industrial districts, okay, these could be easily be designated as intensive high density development areas. These are open areas. They're going to grow. It's bound to happen. You've got this corridor. It's going. This is the east-west route between Gwadar and the rest of the country. This is a possibility. This is a possibility, but this has to come into the master plan. This can't just be done under the Heritage Act. This can't just be done under the bylaws. This has to be an overall policy that takes master planning, heritage, city development, building bylaws all together. And hopefully we can then create these zones where people commute out from, say, North Karachi, Surjani, Gulshan-e Hadid, Gulshan-e Memar, instead of having to all trudge into Sadr and clog up the streets downtown. So, I mean, this is, a larger picture, and this is my proposal. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Arif Saab. This was a great kind of a conclusion to what we were talking about. I would now like to get like a parting way, like a DJ Saab, आप बताएं, आपने अभी ये दो चीजें देखी, अब आपके ख्याल में, if you would like to conclude and give some kind of like a parting words, what would be from the department institution?
जी आरिफ साहब की नो डाउट बहुत बेहतरीन मशवरे हैं, लेकिन एक और वे जो चीज हम डिस्कस करना चाह रहे थे वो एनवायरमेंटल राइट्स, वो इन जो हाई राइज चीजें हैं या इनको जो जिसके अपना राइट्स हैं ओनर्स के, उसको भी ये अपना कर सकता है एनवायरमेंट राइट, क्योंकि हमने एनवायरमेंट वालों से भी बहुत सारी चीजें की हुई हैं। तो ये कैसे आप 2, 3, 4 बंगले हैं, 5 बंगले हैं, उसके बाद अगर वो 4 मंजिला भी बनाना चाहे तो जो पड़ोस वाला है वो बेचारा क्या करेगा? तो उसके भी तो राइट्स है, उसको भी फ्रेश एयर चाहिए, उसको बहुत सारी चीजें चाहिए। तो ये तो हो सकता है कि अब 2 मंजिला एक हेरिटेज बिल्डिंग बनी थी, अगर उसको किसी तरीके से गिर गई है तो उसको आप उसी हवाले से 2 मंजिला की आप इजाजत दें, उसके अलावा उसको ना दें, वरना पड़ोस वाला जो है वो मुतासर होगा। बाकी मेरी जो पहला मशवरा है कि यही हम सारे मिलकर अगर हम इनको यही चीज पे जाएं तो ये एक रीजन है। बाकी तो बहुत सारी चीज अभी दुनिया की हम मिसालें ले रहे हैं, नो डाउट वहाँ पे सुलझी हुई, वहाँ पे ये जो हमारे पास इस तरीके की बिल्डर माफिया है वहाँ पे नहीं है, तो वो चीज को जानते हैं, वो एक दूसरे का केयर करते हैं। हमारे पास तो ये है कि अगर दूसरा भले मरे मरे, मुझे अपने प्रॉफिट के लिए कुछ ना कुछ करना है। तो ये चीजें हो रही हैं, बहुत सारा प्रेशर है, हम उसको सस्टेन कर रहे हैं, लेकिन ये चीज है कि अगर हम इस चीज को आगे बढ़ाएं तो आरिफ साहब की जो चीजें हैं इसको भी साथ में कर सकते हैं, नो डाउट कि हम काम आगे बढ़ सकते हैं।
बिल्कुल, आई मीन ट्रांसफरेबल राइट्स इज अ वेरी बहुत एक हाई एंड एक फिलॉसफी है जिसको अगर अप्लाई किया जाए तो उसके लिए म्यूनिसिपैलिटी को स्ट्रांग होना बहुत जरूरी है, और वो मैनेजमेंट जो शहर की है वो तो इंतहाई क्रिटिकल है इस चीज को अप्लाई करने के लिए। कंसेप्चुअली इट्स अ वेरी स्ट्रांग थॉट, मगर एक शहर कराची जैसा शहर जो कि इतना कॉम्प्लेक्स और इतना कॉम्प्लिकेटेड है, जिसमें डिपार्टमेंट्स एक दूसरे के साथ नहीं काम करते, तो रही बात हेरिटेज तो खुद एक बहुत ही अकेला एक सेक्टर है जो कि हमेशा मारा जाता है बिकॉज दूसरे डिपार्टमेंट्स इतने स्ट्रांग हैं और इतनी उनकी एक अपनी स्ट्रेंथ है। रही बात एनवायरमेंटल राइट्स की, तो डीजी साहब ये भी बहुत जरूरी है, इंपॉर्टेंट फैक्टर आपने उठाया कि अभी हम बिल्कुल साउंड पोल्यूशन को नहीं लेते हैं मरते नजर रखते हुए, हम व्यू राइट्स नहीं लेते हैं कि अगर मेरे घर से एक व्यू नजर आ रहा था, मैंने जब एक जमीन ली आज से 20-30 साल पहले ये सोच के कि हवा भी आएगी व्यू भी आएगा, और अचानक मेरे सामने उसका प्लॉट का एक इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर चेंज हो जाता है, उसके बायलॉज चेंज होके वहां पे एक हाई राइज आ जाती है, तो मैं तो डिप्राइव हो गई अपने सारे राइट्स से, और उसका फिर फ्यूचर में क्या होगा, फिर तो हर एक बिल्डिंग साथ में उसी तरह बढ़ती जाएगी। तो इस तरह की चीजों को मुझे लगता है कि हमारे अभी हेरिटेज इंस्टीट्यूशन और एक गवर्नमेंट के इदारे से अगर इसके ऊपर कोई हम एक अवेयरनेस प्रोग्राम चलाएं तो ये इस पे तो बहुत, मैं तो हमेशा बोलती रहती हूँ कि गवर्नमेंट का अवेयरनेस प्रोग्राम चाहे वो बायलॉज से हो, चाहे वो जो कॉन्स्टिट्यूशनल राइट्स हैं हेरिटेज के ओनर्स के, वो होने चाहिए। क्योंकि मैं आपसे जो पिछले सवाल जो पूछ रही थी वो ये था कि जब किसी बिल्डिंग के ऊपर स्टे ऑर्डर या शोकेस लग जाता है तो उसके बाद क्या होता है? वो बिल्डिंग के ऊपर तो लग गया, वो डेवलपर तो उस पर काम नहीं कर रहा, मगर इन्वायरमेंटल डिटीरिएशन तो होती रहती है ना, वो बिल्डिंग तो और खराब होती जाती है। तो फिर कुछ अरसे बाद जैसे कांजी बिल्डिंग है, वो इतनी खूबसूरत इमारत है, उसकी एलिवेशन रह गई है, अंदर से वो टूटी हुई है और उस पर स्टे ऑर्डर लगा हुआ है, अब उसका फ्यूचर क्या होगा, उसके बारे में आप बताएं। इन जो बिल्डिंग जिनके ऊपर स्टे ऑर्डर्स लग जाते हैं, इसका क्या होता है?
ओनर जो है ना, उनका सबसे बड़ा हथियार यही है कि स्टे लेकर बैठ जाएं और ये आहिस्ता आहिस्ता 2 साल में, 5 साल में, इवन 10 साल में वो गिर जाएगी चीज, और वो उसको फेवर में जाता है। तो अगर किसी ने, अच्छा, वो उसमें ये होता है, बिल्डर खासतौर पे ये खासतौर पे चीजें कर रही हैं कि वो इस तरीके से करते हैं क्योंकि उनकी प्रॉपर्टी की वैल्यू भी बढ़ती जा रही है और वो उसके फेवर में जाता है कि वो स्टे लेकर बैठ जाते हैं, और हमारे पास ये एक स्टे, आप कल जाएंगे आपको स्टे मिल जाएगा। तो ये एक रीजन है बहुत सारा जिसको हम।
तो मंसूर साहब, इसके बारे में हम क्या कर सकते हैं? इसका क्या मतलब, अभी जो लॉ नया जो 2023 पे हम फोकस कर रहे थे, उसमें कोई ऐसी बात है जिसमें इन बिल्डिंग्स को कोई प्रोटेक्शन मिल सकती है?
उसमें हमने ये सजेस्ट किया है कि अगर कोई हेरिटेज बिल्डिंग है और उसमें अगर हमने ये महसूस किया या कमेटी ने महसूस किया कि इसको जानबूझ के गिरा के उनको कमर्शलाइज करने का उनका इरादा है, तो उस पर हमेशा के लिए ये बैन लगा रहे हैं कि वो फिर कमर्शियल नहीं हो पाएगा। तो यही उनका हल है कि उनको, ये बिल्डर को ये डर होगा कि अगर मैं ये 5 साल के बाद, 10 साल के बाद फिर जाके मैं इसको, ये गिर जाएगी और फिर मैं हाई राइज बना दूंगा, तो उसको ये कम से कम बैन होगा कि वो जो प्लाट है वो हेरिटेज डिक्लेयर है, वो दोबारा कमर्शियल नहीं हो पाएगा। अगर उसको हेरिटेज बनानी भी होगी तो वो जैसे पहली बिल्डिंग थी वैसे ही उसको बनानी पड़ेगी, वही उसका जो प्लान होगा पास होगा, अदरवाइज नहीं होगा। तो ये एक हमने उसमें डाला है, तो ये बहुत काफी हद तक हमें सपोर्ट करेगा उस चीज को।
थैंक यू। मैं, कुछ सवाल आए हुए हैं ऑडियंस से, मैं उनको जरा पढ़ लूं। पहले ये आया हुआ है कि थैंक यू फॉर अ वेरी इंफॉर्मेटिव प्रेजेंटेशन, दिस डायलॉग टुडे स्पेशली important between different department parties. I came to see Arif sir especially, and I'm glad I'm here for today's session. Unfortunately, she has to step out for class. So thank you so much for Sabah coming for this talk. Arif Saab, who pays for these rights? Fawad Sumro is asking. The only sustainable way is to government to create a fund for this. But would government acknowledge that it cannot enforce to through a decree and opts for a market-based solution? Property developer can develop new area in any case without for these rights. Fascinating idea, nevertheless, Fawad Saab says. So would you like to respond to that?
The whole point is not to get the government involved, because the government wouldn't have the funds to, it doesn't have the money to create a fund. The point is that, if you create, let's say you have 2 areas, one is Sadr and one is somewhere else, and you decide that Sadr you want to retain as 1:2 FAR, and the other place you say, we'll keep it a little bit open-ended, right? And if you said that without this, if you're saying both areas are 1:5, 5.5, or 1:5, then you could allow the receiving area to build beyond 1:5 by taking development rights from the heritage area. Did I explain that clearly, or was I all over the place?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. I mean, that's the idea is कि जहां आपके पास फर्ज करें 4 मंजिला बिल्डिंग है और जोनिंग के हिसाब से वहां पे आप 12 मंजिला बिल्डिंग बना सकते हैं, तो वो 8 मंजिल जो है आप कहीं और दे दें, और वो बंदा जो है जो वहां पे 12 मंजिला बिल्डिंग बनाने के बजाय 12 + 8 20 मंजिला बिल्डिंग बना देगा. So he would buy. So you're creating a marketplace.
And I think, Arif Saab, it's very important to bring this kind of conversation into IAP and invite the Heritage Department and the representatives from the government to come. And this should be an exercise by the institution itself.
Certainly.
Maybe with the architects to come up with an idea of how zoning plays a huge role. Yeah. And here I would like to kind of conclude the webinar also in.
I'd just like to add one thing, if you permit me.
Yeah.
I just want to say, look, real estate is this huge industry with a lot of money, okay? And they are very influential. And they are a part of the economy of this city and of this country. And one should be trying to promote it, but you can't let them run amok. You can't let them just, destroy everything that we consider to be heritage and valuable and preservable. And so, there has to be some limits, but you have to encourage it in such a way that there is a win-win situation. I mean, what is heritage to one person is real estate to somebody else. There has to be some way where these things work out. And to me, the trading of development rights is a win-win situation.
Yeah. And it's very also important to think about cities from a social construct as well. It's not always about economic gain. कुछ ऐसी जगहें होती हैं जिनको हमें सोशल थिंकिंग के तहत सोचना पड़ेगा, वरना तो शहर हर तरह से प्राइवेट पब्लिक पार्टनरशिप में ही बिक जाएगा. इस पे मैं डॉक्टर मासूमा से सवाल पूछूंगी कि डॉक्टर मासूमा, आफ्टर लुकिंग एंड हियरिंग डीजी साहब एंड आरिफ साहब, and also the current conversation that's going between us, how would you like to conclude it from an academic and researcher perspective, and then we will conclude today's webinar. If you would like to share some words.
Yes, I actually wanted to add a few things to the conversation. I think that transferable development rights is a very good idea, but generally, I mean, various ideas are good, but I feel that master planning authority has, we require one for Karachi that is a good and a strong body, and which is multidisciplinary as well. तो ये मुझे लगता है कि ये एक बहुत ज़रूरी वो है in order to make various kinds of decisions for the city. New development जो है वो शहर के बहुत से हिस्सों में हो सकती है, लेकिन हेरिटेज कुछ एरिया में ही होता है. तो ये डेफिनेटली ट्रांसफरेबल डेवलपमेंट राइट्स के साथ और जोनिंग के साथ, डेंसिटी FARs के कंट्रोल के साथ, क्योंकि हर जगह पे FARs, हाई FARs अलाउ नहीं कर सकते, कुछ एरियाज में होते हैं, कुछ एरियाज में नहीं होते. तो हेरिटेज एरियाज के साथ भी इसको इट हैज टू बी अ वर्किंग दिस थिंग फॉर दिस. तो डेफिनेटली आई थिंक इकोनॉमिक कंपैटिबिलिटी ऑफ हेरिटेज एरियाज नीड टू बी रीचेक्ड, बट a master planning authority, I think, is very important for making these decisions and for also enforcing control. I think your question to Kunasro Saab about SBCA के साथ जो relationship है culture department का और वो कितना follow करते हैं, respect करते हैं, ये बहुत ज़्यादा अहम है कि वो follow up और enforcement of law भी उस तरह से हो. I think that's about it. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate डीजी साहब आपका आना और आपका वक्त देना, हमारी बात की एक तरह से कॉन्वर्जेशन में पार्ट लेना, क्योंकि हम अक्सर अपने आर्किटेक्ट्स और एकेडमिक्स और रिसर्चर में बात करते रहते हैं, मगर गवर्नमेंट अक्सर अमूमन इन कॉन्वर्जेशन से मिसिंग होती है. एंड शायद ये आज एक पहली कड़ी है हमारी कॉन्वर्जेशन की, और ये चलती रहे तो ये बहुत ज़रूरी है कि हम एज सिविल सोसाइटी, आर्किटेक्ट्स, डेवलपर्स, एक्टिविस्ट्स, हम सब मिलके आपके साथ काम कर सके. बिकॉज हेरिटेज जो है वो सबका ही विरसा है, ये डिपार्टमेंट का एक उसके ऊपर जिम्मेदारी नहीं है सिर्फ, बल्कि हम सब इंस्टीट्यूशनल पार्टनर्स की एक बहुत ज़रूरी एक पार्टनरशिप की ज़रूरत है. सो मैं आपका बहुत बहुत शुक्रगुजार हूँ कि आपने वक्त निकाला और आप आए. And Dr. Masuma and Arif Saab, really, thank you so much from Pakistan Chowk Community Center for sharing your thoughts and sharing your concepts.